The first time I realized they'd crossed a line, I wasn't standing in front of my house arguing with anyone. I was halfway down the mountain road, phone buzzing in my hand, listening to a flat, bored voice tell me my vehicle had already been removed from the property. Not warned, not tagged, removed. By the time I pulled over, the damage was already done. The kind you don't undo by shouting, threatening, or begging. The kind you document, measure, and return. Slowly. They called it an eyesore. That word stayed with me as I stared through the windshield at pine trees and a strip of lake water flashing silver between them. Eyesore. That's what the woman on the phone said the HOA had declared it. An abandoned vehicle, a violation, something that lowered community standards. She didn't know what it was. She didn't ask. She read what she was told to read and waited for me to hang up. I didn't. I asked where it was taken. She gave me the yard address, a tow company name, and a case number. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the engine idle. I've learned over the years that when something feels wrong, you don't rush to correct it. You let it show you how wrong it really is. I'm Jacob. I'm 51 years old. I retired from the U.S. Army as a colonel after more than 2 decades of service. My father wore a uniform before I ever did. Vietnam, then the Gulf, long before respect for that kind of service became optional. I don't raise my voice in public, and I don't react on impulse. I learned early that authority doesn't announce itself. It waits. The house I live in now sits above a mountain lake in a community that prides itself on being exclusive. Gated road, private docks, a homeowners association that sends out glossy newsletters about preserving value and maintaining order. When I bought the place, I read every bylaw they handed me. I always do. It's a habit from a life where details decide outcomes. The garage is detached, stone-faced, older than most of the homes around it. Inside, it sat a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, fully restored, garage kept, climate-controlled, insured at a value that made the numbers on their little violation notices look like a joke. It wasn't parked on the street. It wasn't leaking oil. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't visible unless you were already trespassing. None of that mattered to them. I found out later that the decision had been made at an HOA board meeting I wasn't informed about. A complaint was raised. A vote was taken. A rule was interpreted. The president of the association, Melissa Hargrove, signed off on the order herself. 47 years old. Loud. Confident. The kind of person who mistakes being heard for being right. By the time I reached the tow yard, the Mustang was already behind a chain-link fence, parked crooked between a rusted pickup and a sun-bleached sedan missing 2 wheels. Seeing it there didn't make my blood boil. It made something else happen, something quieter. The part of my brain that used to map enemy positions started drawing lines. The clerk tried to hand me a release form with a storage fee highlighted in yellow. I asked him who authorized the tow. He shrugged and pointed at the paperwork. HOA. I asked if he'd inspected the vehicle before moving it. He said no. I asked if he'd noted its condition. He said they never do. I paid nothing. I took photos. A lot of them. Angles. VIN plate. Interior. Undercarriage. Tire marks where chains had been wrapped too tight. Then I left. That night, my phone lit up with an email from the HOA office. Formal language, policy references, a reminder that future violations would result in escalating penalties. No apology. No acknowledgement that a mistake might have been made. Just authority, assumed and unchallenged. I replied with a single sentence confirming receipt. Melissa didn't like that. The next morning, she showed up at my door with her husband. He stood a half step behind her, arms crossed, posture stiff in the way retired cops never quite lose. He didn't introduce himself. She did. Loudly. She explained that the board had acted in the community's best interest, and that if I had an issue, I could take it up through proper channels. I asked her which channel authorized the seizure of private property without notice. She told me not to get hostile. I asked her if she knew what the car was. She told me it didn't matter. That was the moment everything locked into place. Not anger, certainty. I told her I would be handling it through proper channels. I thanked her for stopping by. I closed the door while she was still talking. Over the next few days, letters arrived. One from the HOA lawyer, warning me about non-compliance. One from the tow company, reminding me of accruing fees. One from the association again, advising me that further non-cooperation could result in liens. I answered none of them right away. Instead, I made calls to the State Historic Vehicle Registry, to an appraiser who specialized in mid-century American automobiles, to a legal contact who owed me a favor from a long time ago. I pulled out documents I hadn't needed in years and laid them out on the dining table, aligning edges, checking dates, confirming serials. Every action they'd taken assumed I was just another homeowner who would panic, argue, maybe threaten to sue, then fold. They assumed I didn't know process. They assumed I wouldn't wait. They were wrong on all counts. By the end of the week, Melissa sent one more message, this time less formal, more personal. She reminded me that the association always wins these things and suggested I save myself the trouble. I read it once, archived it, and went back to work. Because when someone declares something an eyesore without knowing what it is, they're not just making a mistake. They're building a record. And once a record exists, it can be used. By the time the second notice arrived, I had already stopped thinking of the car as something I needed to recover and started treating it as evidence. That shift matters. When you frame something as property, people argue about value. When you frame it as evidence, the conversation changes to liability. The HOA didn't know that yet. The letter came by certified mail, heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind meant to look official enough to scare someone into compliance. It listed dates, cited bylaws, and restated the same claim. The vehicle had been classified as abandoned and detrimental to the community. It demanded immediate payment of towing and storage fees, and warned that failure to comply could result in further enforcement action. There was no mention of inspection, no photographs, no acknowledgement that the car had been kept inside a locked, private structure. Just assertions. I set the letter aside and continued doing what I always do when someone overplays authority. I verified everything. I pulled the HOA's own governing documents and read the sections they cited, then the ones they didn't. The definitions section was especially interesting. Their rules allowed enforcement against vehicles left in common areas or visible from public roadways. Mine met neither condition. The garage wasn't a common area. The car wasn't visible. Their authority ended at my property line. That wasn't an interpretation. It was written plainly. Next, I reviewed the state code on non-consensual tows. The requirements were strict. Notice, documentation, reasonable cause. None of those boxes had been checked. The tow company's paperwork reflected that too. They had accepted the HOA's word and nothing else. No inspection report. No pre-tow photos. No confirmation of abandonment. Mistakes like that compound. I drove back to the tow yard with a small flashlight and a notepad. This time, I didn't ask to see the car. I asked to see their intake logs. The clerk hesitated, then called a supervisor. The supervisor said they couldn't release internal records without authorization. I nodded, thanked him, and asked for the name of their insurance carrier. That changed the tone. He asked why I needed it. I told him I was documenting damage caused during an unauthorized seizure of private property. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just stated facts in the present tense. He gave me the name. On the drive home, my phone rang again. This time it was Melissa. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She said I was being difficult. She said the board had acted unanimously. She said if I kept escalating, the association would respond accordingly. I told her escalation was a matter of perspective. She laughed. A short, dismissive sound. She reminded me that HOA attorneys deal with cases like this all the time, and that I was wasting my energy. I asked her if the board had taken a vote after reviewing the vehicle in person. She said they didn't need to. That answer told me everything I needed to know about how this would end. Over the next few days, the paper trail grew thicker. I received an invoice from the tow company, now including daily storage fees. I received a follow-up from the HOA lawyer, repeating the threat of liens. I saved everything. I didn't reply. Silence makes people uncomfortable. They fill it with mistakes. Meanwhile, the appraiser finished his report. He documented the restoration process, the originality of the components, the condition of the interior, the provenance of the vehicle. He attached photographs, serial numbers, and a valuation that exceeded the maximum coverage limits listed in the HOA's own insurance policy. The historic registry responded too. The Mustang qualified, not as a novelty, not as a hobby car, as a preserved example of a historically significant model year, maintained to standards consistent with museum display. The paperwork was clear. The process was formal, and once submitted, it created a record the HOA couldn't erase. I forwarded nothing to them yet. Instead, I requested the minutes from the HOA board meeting where the tow had been authorized. State law required them to provide those upon request. They stalled at first, then sent a redacted version that removed names and discussion points. That alone was a violation. I requested the unredacted copy and cited the statute. They complied the second time. Melissa's name appeared 3 times in bold. Motion proposed. Motion seconded. Motion approved. Her husband's name wasn't on the board, but his comments were included under guest remarks. He'd advised them that enforcement would be straightforward, and that homeowners usually back down once fines are applied. He'd been wrong before. That wasn't new. The HOA lawyer finally called me directly. His tone was measured, careful. He asked why I hadn't simply paid the fees and retrieved the car. I asked him whether he'd reviewed the tow authorization before sending demand letters. He paused. I asked him whether he was aware that the vehicle was stored inside a private garage. Another pause. I asked him if he'd confirmed that the HOA had authority to enter my property. He said he would look into it. That was the first crack. A few days later, I received an amended letter from his office. The language had changed. No more threats, no mention of liens, just a request to discuss the matter and explore a resolution. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't confidence either. Melissa didn't take that shift well. She confronted me at the mailbox one afternoon, voice raised, accusing me of going behind the board's back. She said I was undermining community trust. She said the association had rules for a reason. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I asked her if she'd ever read the state statute governing historic property seizure. She said that didn't apply. I told her it did now. Her husband stepped forward, posture stiffening, and reminded me that he knew how these situations usually end. I told him I did too. I walked back to my house without another word. By then, the damage assessment was complete. The transport chains had scuffed the undercarriage. The front suspension showed signs of stress. Minor issues, but expensive ones. Issues that don't happen if a vehicle is handled properly. I added the report to the growing file on my desk. Everything they had done was documented. Everything they had failed to do was documented too. I wasn't building an argument. I was building a timeline. The final email of the week came from the HOA lawyer again. Short, direct. He informed me that the association was reviewing its position and that further enforcement action was being suspended pending clarification. Melissa didn't know yet that she'd lost control of the process. She still thought this was about compliance, about asserting dominance, about proving the HOA couldn't be challenged. It wasn't. It was about what happens when people mistake noise for authority and forget that rules cut both ways. Once enforcement stopped, the tone of everything shifted. Not because anyone admitted fault, but because uncertainty crept in. People who rely on authority don't handle uncertainty well. They start asking questions they should have asked earlier, and they ask them too late. The tow yard called first. A different voice this time, polite, careful. He told me they'd received a request from the HOA asking about the status of the vehicle and whether storage fees were still accruing. I asked him if the car had been moved again since my last visit. He said no. I asked if anyone from the HOA had come to inspect it. He said no. I asked if they were aware the tow had been unauthorized. He hesitated, then said they were looking into that. I told him to make a note in their system that the vehicle was subject to a legal dispute and that no further handling was permitted without my written consent. He agreed. I could hear him typing as we spoke. That call mattered more than he realized. The HOA sent out a community-wide email later that afternoon. It framed the situation as a temporary administrative review and reassured residents that standards were being upheld. Melissa's name was at the bottom, bolded, like always. The language was defensive, not confident. That told me she'd been warned by someone she didn't outrank. I spent the next few days meeting with people who understood process better than power. The attorney I brought in didn't raise his eyebrows when I laid everything out. He didn't comment on Melissa's behavior. He focused on dates, signatures, and omissions. When I showed him the appraisal and the registry confirmation, he nodded once and said we had leverage. Not the loud kind, the permanent kind. He drafted a notice of unlawful seizure and sent it to the HOA's counsel and insurance carrier simultaneously. That detail was intentional. Once insurers are involved, bravado disappears. Numbers replace opinions. Risk replaces ego. The response came faster than anything else had so far. The HOA lawyer requested a meeting. In person. Neutral location. No board members present. Just him, me, and the attorney. I agreed. He arrived early, folder already open, papers marked with tabs. He didn't waste time pretending this was a misunderstanding. He acknowledged that the tow had occurred without proper verification. He acknowledged that the board had relied on assumptions rather than documentation. He acknowledged that the vehicle's classification changed the legal landscape. He did not mention Melissa by name. We discussed remedies, release of the vehicle without fees, compensation for damage, reimbursement of costs. I listened. I let him finish. Then I slid the appraisal across the table and told him we were past retrieval. He looked at the number and went quiet. I explained that the car's historic status triggered additional protections under state law, and that unlawful seizure carried statutory penalties. I explained that the tow company's actions exposed them as well, and that their insurer had already been notified. I explained that resolving the matter privately would require more than returning what had been taken. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted acknowledgement of fault, full restitution, and confirmation that the HOA would cease enforcement actions related to the vehicle permanently. I also told him that any attempt to retaliate through fines or policy changes would be documented and addressed separately. He nodded again, slower this time. Melissa didn't hear about that meeting until after it happened. When she did, she reacted the only way she knew how. She called an emergency board session and invited half the neighborhood. She framed it as transparency. It wasn't. It was damage control. I attended. She spoke first, voice sharp, reciting rules and emphasizing authority. She implied I was exploiting loopholes. She suggested the board had been misled. When residents asked why the car had been towed without notice, she deflected. When someone asked whether the association had insurance for this kind of thing, she didn't answer. Her husband stood up and tried to reframe the issue as a matter of compliance culture. He talked about discipline, about precedent, about not letting one homeowner undermine collective standards. I watched the room change as he spoke. People don't like being reminded they're next. When it was my turn, I didn't speak long. I stated facts, dates, actions, consequences. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I didn't mention military service. I didn't have to. The documentation did the work. The HOA lawyer was there too, sitting off to the side. He didn't speak at all. He didn't need to. His presence said more than anything he could have added. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend all enforcement related to my property, pending legal review. Melissa announced the result with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the first vote she hadn't controlled. Afterward, a few neighbors approached me quietly. They asked questions, not about the car, but about the HOA, about fines they'd paid without understanding why, about warnings they'd received for things that had never been problems before. I answered what I could and told them to request records. That night, the tow company emailed confirmation that storage fees had been frozen. The insurer followed up with a request for documentation. I sent everything. Clean, organized, time-stamped. The Mustang stayed where it was for now, but it no longer felt out of reach. It felt anchored, like a piece on a board that couldn't be moved without consequence. Melissa sent one more message, short, sharp. She accused me of embarrassing the board and warned that the community wouldn't forget it. I didn't reply. By then, the situation had outgrown her. What started as a power play had become a liability issue involving insurers, attorneys, and statutes she'd never read. Authority doesn't survive contact with accountability, and accountability was just getting started. Once insurers enter a situation, the pace changes. Not faster, cleaner. Conversations become quieter, written, and precise. People stop posturing and start calculating. That's when you learn who actually understands the system and who's been hiding behind it. The HOA's insurance carrier reached out first, not to me directly, but to my attorney. They requested a full chronology, copies of all correspondence, photographs of the vehicle before and after the tow, and documentation supporting the historic classification. We sent everything in a single packet, no commentary, no embellishment, just facts arranged in the order they happened. 2 days later, the tow company's insurer contacted us as well. That's when the dynamic shifted from disagreement to exposure. The tow operator who'd authorized the removal submitted a written statement. In it, he admitted that no inspection had been performed, and that he relied entirely on the HOA's representation that the vehicle was abandoned and subject to removal. He included the text message he'd received from the HOA office, confirming authorization. Melissa's name was on it. That message mattered. It established that the tow wasn't an independent decision. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an instruction. Once that distinction exists, liability stops being abstract. It attaches to people. Melissa responded the way she always did, by getting louder. She sent a follow-up email to the entire community accusing outside influences of interfering with HOA operations. She framed the insurer inquiries as routine audits. She warned residents not to communicate with attorneys without board approval. That last part caught attention. State law doesn't allow an HOA to restrict communication with insurers or legal counsel in matters involving potential misconduct. Several residents knew that. A few forwarded the email to my attorney. Others forwarded it to the insurer. By the end of the week, the HOA lawyer sent a notice to the board, advising them to cease all mass communications related to the matter. He didn't copy Melissa directly. He copied the vice president. That omission was deliberate. At the same time, the historic registry completed its review. The Mustang was formally accepted, designation number issued, status recorded. The confirmation letter was addressed to me and copied to the State Preservation Office. That created a second record, independent of anything the HOA controlled. Once property enters that category, the standards change. Unauthorized handling isn't just negligence, it's interference with protected assets. The penalties scale accordingly. We forwarded the designation to both insurers. The response was immediate. The tow company's insurer proposed settlement talks. The HOA's insurer requested mediation. Both requested confidentiality. Neither used the word mistake. They didn't have to. The math said it for them. Melissa called me that night. Not an email, not a letter, a call. Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested rehearsal. She said the situation had escalated beyond expectations and suggested we resolve things neighbor to neighbor. She implied that dragging insurers into it would harm the community. She said people were talking. I told her communities aren't harmed by accountability. They're harmed by people who avoid it. She asked what I wanted again. I told her I'd already said it. Restitution, acknowledgement, permanent cessation of enforcement related to the vehicle. I added that further attempts to influence residents or restrict communication would be documented. She went quiet for a moment, then said she'd talk to the board. The next HOA meeting was different. Smaller room, closed session, fewer raised voices. The vice president did most of the speaking. The treasurer asked questions about coverage limits and deductibles. The HOA lawyer attended remotely and interrupted twice to clarify risk. Melissa spoke last, briefly, defensive. She insisted the board had acted in good faith. The lawyer didn't challenge her. He didn't support her either. He just redirected the conversation back to exposure. After the meeting, the board voted to authorize mediation. That vote passed without Melissa's support. The mediator was neutral, experienced, and unimpressed by titles. He laid out the issues in plain terms: unlawful seizure, documented damage, statutory penalties, reputational risk. He asked the HOA to explain their authority. They cited bylaws. He asked whether those bylaws superseded state law. They didn't answer. When it was my turn, I didn't speak much. I provided records. The mediator reviewed them silently, flipping pages, pausing at dates, underlining names. When he reached the historic designation, he leaned back and asked the HOA's counsel whether they'd reviewed that statute. The lawyer admitted they had not at the time of enforcement. That admission went into the record. By the end of the session, the mediator recommended full restitution, reimbursement of costs, compensation for damages, and policy revision to prevent similar actions. He also noted that failure to comply could result in litigation with a strong likelihood of adverse judgment. The insurers agreed. The HOA requested time. Melissa didn't. She objected to the recommendation and accused the process of being biased. She argued that granting compensation would encourage defiance. The mediator let her speak, then asked whether she understood that the recommendation was advisory, not optional. She didn't respond. A week later, the insurers sent formal settlement proposals. The amounts were significant, not catastrophic, but enough to hurt. Enough to trigger internal questions about leadership decisions and oversight. The board accepted. Melissa did not sign. Her refusal forced a secondary review. The insurer required confirmation that the board's acceptance reflected majority consent and that no individual officer was acting outside scope. That triggered a governance audit. Emails were requested, meeting minutes, internal communications. Everything Melissa had put in writing came back out. The audit found that she'd exceeded her authority on multiple occasions, not just with the tow. Prior warnings, selective enforcement, unauthorized communications. Patterns emerged. Once patterns exist, narratives change. The insurer issued a reservation of rights letter. That's the kind of letter people don't forget. It meant coverage might not apply to actions taken outside authorized duties. It meant personal exposure. It meant consequences. The board convened again, this time without Melissa present. She'd been advised by counsel not to attend. The vote that followed wasn't dramatic. No speeches, no arguments, just a motion to suspend her pending further review. It passed, quietly. The settlement finalized soon after. The Mustang was released without fees. Damages were paid, costs reimbursed. The agreement included a clause permanently prohibiting the HOA from enforcement actions related to the vehicle and requiring policy revisions to align with state law. The car was transported properly this time. Enclosed carrier, white gloves, documentation at every step. When it returned to the garage, it looked the same as it always had. The difference was everything around it. Melissa sent one final message. Not angry, not loud, short. She said she never thought it would go this far. I didn't reply. Because it hadn't gone far. It had gone exactly where systems go when people mistake authority for immunity. Once the settlement was finalized, the Mustang was back in the garage where it belonged, gleaming under the low light as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Nothing about this was over. Not for them, not for me. It was over for the car, yes, but the real work, the consequences, was just beginning. Melissa Hargrove had underestimated what it meant to provoke someone who doesn't panic, who doesn't argue, and who documents everything. That mistake would cost her more than the money she had already surrendered. The next morning, I walked around the property, clipboard in hand, checking the perimeter, noting sight lines, and reviewing HOA boundaries. This wasn't paranoia, it was diligence. I had learned long ago that boundaries exist for a reason, and they are often challenged by people who think rules are optional. I started with small things. A call to the local historic society confirming my Mustang's designation as a protected vehicle. They filed a notice of recognition that duplicated my previous submission and added language about preservation, care, and public interest. That made it harder for anyone to argue that the vehicle could be moved or modified without permission. Next, I sent a copy of the designation to the HOA's insurer. Formal, polite. Attached documentation, the appraiser's notes and photographs. Nothing emotional, facts only. They responded immediately with acknowledgement. No commentary, no judgment, just the record. Then came the board. I requested public disclosure of prior actions related to the vehicle. The law requires transparency for any enforcement action impacting property owners. That request forced Melissa to respond. She prepared a statement full of legalese and deflection. I forwarded it, unedited, to the State Preservation Office and the local newspaper that covered community affairs. The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Neighbors who had once deferred to her authority began whispering. Questions appeared in emails and local forums. Why was this done without notice? What authority did the HOA really have? Who signed the order? Each question documented, each record stored. Melissa tried to assert control again. She called a private meeting with several board members, her husband at her side, confident she could reassert dominance. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Her words, her planning, her emails, all of it, was already in the hands of people who could use it, legally. Then, the HOA lawyer made a move. He requested a meeting with Melissa, privately, not with the board, not with me. She bristled but complied. The lawyer walked her through the exposure created by her prior actions: exceeding authority, unauthorized seizure, failure to document, and potential personal liability. He highlighted the historic registry designation and the state law protecting the property. She was silent most of the meeting. Her husband tried to intervene, but was shut down. The lawyer's tone left no room for argument. By the end of that week, the board convened another session. Melissa attempted to dominate the discussion, but the attorney representing the HOA now guided the agenda. She was muted by procedure. Points she tried to raise were ruled irrelevant. Every objection she made had been preempted by the facts she herself had documented over the months. I didn't attend that session either. I watched from a distance. Reports filtered back. The board voted to implement permanent changes to prevent unauthorized enforcement. Policies that previously gave her free rein were revoked. Oversight was required for every action moving forward. The Mustang remained untouched in the garage, but the authority she had wielded so carelessly had evaporated. It wasn't immediate, dramatic, or loud. It was methodical, quiet, irreversible. Melissa sent me a message afterward, short, sharp. She asked why I didn't gloat, why I didn't celebrate, why I didn't taunt her in public. I didn't reply. Victory doesn't need performance. Systems enforce it for you. The community noticed the shift. HOA newsletters became less aggressive. Meeting minutes were clearer. The tone of authority softened. People started questioning the rationale behind prior enforcement actions. The pattern she had relied on to intimidate neighbors was gone. Her husband stopped visiting. Melissa tried to maintain control through whispers and private meetings, but the network of oversight now ensured she couldn't act without consequences. Every word, every instruction, every attempt to intimidate was being documented in real time by someone who knew exactly how to use it. By the end of the month, the Mustang wasn't just a car in a garage. It was a symbol, proof that authority doesn't exist without accountability. That power unchecked is temporary. That mistakes born from arrogance don't go unpunished. And that revenge, when executed properly, doesn't need theatrics. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall. I took precision in it. Quiet, calculated, methodical. Every step she took to assert power only dug her deeper, and every record of her missteps now existed outside her control. At this point, the story was no longer just about a car. It was about establishing precedent, demonstrating limits, showing what happens when someone mistakes noise for authority and underestimates someone who knows how to wait, watch, and act through systems designed to hold them accountable. Melissa may have believed she still had influence. She didn't. Not anymore. The Mustang was safe. The law had spoken. The systems she thought she controlled were rewriting themselves without her input, and the quiet authority of someone who doesn't panic, doesn't shout, and doesn't underestimate process was in full effect. The real work, the permanent work, had just begun. By the time the next month rolled around, the Mustang was more than just a car in a garage. It had become the center of a quiet but unyielding storm. Every action Melissa tried to take, every attempt to regain authority, was met with calm resistance, documentation, or legal pushback. She still didn't fully realize that this was no longer about her ego. This was about accountability, and that is something no amount of bluster can erase. It started with minor challenges. She tried to issue notices to other homeowners, attempting to enforce policies selectively, what she had once done to me. But each notice was met with questions. Which section allows this? Was a vote held? Where's the documentation? The questions themselves became weapons. Every response, or lack thereof, was recorded, time-stamped, and filed. I spent hours reviewing emails, HOA correspondence, and community forums. Every inconsistency in her statements or procedures was cataloged. Every deviation from rules and state law was noted. By this point, the community had begun noticing too. Subtle whispers circulated about the fairness of enforcement and the misuse of power. Melissa's name appeared repeatedly, in ways she could not control. Then came the more formal moves. I requested an independent inspection of HOA enforcement practices, citing prior incidents as a basis for review. State regulators obliged, assigning an auditor to review internal procedures, meeting minutes, and enforcement logs. Melissa's errors were highlighted extensively. Each unauthorized action, each skipped step, each misrepresentation of policy was noted in black and white. When the auditor requested interviews, Melissa tried to downplay her involvement. She claimed she had relied on advice from her husband and counsel. That admission, once documented, became even more damning. Reliance on improper guidance doesn't excuse overstepping authority. Her credibility began eroding, not just among the board, but among the community and legal representatives watching quietly in the background. Meanwhile, I continued to prepare. The Mustang's historic registration had opened the door for additional scrutiny, and I was careful to follow every procedural step flawlessly. I gathered photographs, receipts, witness statements, and previous records of improper HOA actions. By now, the document folder on my desk was thick enough to intimidate anyone who assumed authority could override legality. One afternoon, I received a call from the HOA lawyer. His tone had changed. It was no longer cautious or professional. It carried the tension of someone facing risk for the first time. He asked for a meeting, specifically to discuss settlement terms for ongoing exposure beyond the Mustang incident. I agreed. At the meeting, I laid out the facts again: unlawful seizure, improper enforcement, damages incurred, and procedural violations. I included the new audit reports and community complaints. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply presented the evidence in chronological order. Each page, each photograph, each record spoke louder than words. Melissa had been excluded from this particular meeting, but her presence was felt through the documents, emails, and messages she had generated herself. Every attempt she had made to maintain control had been recorded, every misstep documented, every boast of authority had become evidence. The lawyer and the auditor listened carefully. They both understood, finally, that Melissa's influence was now contained. She no longer held unilateral power. The board's oversight mechanisms, combined with statutory and insurance requirements, had cornered her. Attempts to manipulate policy or intimidate residents were now easily traceable and legally actionable. Following that meeting, I turned my attention back to the Mustang itself. I made minor adjustments, not to alter its value, but to reinforce its status. Additional preservation measures were implemented, photographs updated, registry confirmations filed. Every step ensured that the car remained untouchable under law and under HOA authority. Melissa tried one last move. She sent a terse email to the community, implying that the historic designation was irrelevant to HOA enforcement. I forwarded it to the auditors, the State Preservation Office, and the insurance companies, unedited. The implications were clear. Her argument had collapsed under scrutiny. By the end of the week, the board convened without her input and voted to adopt new enforcement protocols and oversight rules. These changes ensured that no single individual could repeat the errors that had triggered the entire saga. Melissa's ability to act unilaterally had been permanently removed. I watched from the edge, as always. The Mustang rested silently in the garage. The papers, the evidence, the historic designation, all of it had done its work. The power that had once seemed so absolute, so untouchable, had been stripped away, step by step, quietly and methodically. And in that quiet, controlled process, revenge had been delivered. Not with anger, but with precision. No shouting, no threats, no public spectacle, just consequences. Systematic, permanent, undeniable consequences. Melissa would remember this lesson for the rest of her tenure. And everyone around her would remember that unchecked authority comes with limits, especially when someone who knows how to wait, observe, and act steps into the arena. By now, the story was no longer about a car. It was about power, accountability, and the way mistakes compound when arrogance meets someone prepared to let the system do its work. The Mustang remained untouched, gleaming, untouchable, and Melissa's authority, once a towering presence, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. The final weeks were quiet, almost eerily so. The Mustang sat in the garage, immaculate as ever, reflecting sunlight through the garage windows, a monument to patience, precision, and preparation. It had survived the tow, the threats, and the intimidation. But more than that, it had become a symbol of accountability. Every surface gleamed, every detail intact, and every record of the events surrounding it carefully archived. Melissa Hargrove had retreated into herself. She no longer held the meetings, no longer dictated the agenda, no longer had the board's ear. The oversight mechanisms implemented after the audits made sure of that. Her husband kept a distance, and her influence among residents had faded. Every whisper of her authority was now traceable, and every attempt at control documented. The power she had wielded so carelessly was gone. The community, too, had changed. Neighbors who once deferred blindly to her commands now questioned policies. They asked for records, documentation, and explanations. The HOA newsletters had been rewritten to reflect transparency. New procedures prevented anyone from acting unilaterally. The structure she relied on for intimidation had been transformed into a system of accountability. I spent time reviewing every document one last time, making sure the timeline was airtight. The historic designation, appraisals, emails, meeting minutes, and audit findings were organized and cross-referenced. Each piece reinforced the others. No room for misinterpretation. No space for revisionist history. Every detail stood as evidence of the complete sequence of events, the consequences of arrogance, and the inevitability of accountability. Melissa attempted a final maneuver, a private note to the board questioning the implementation of certain policy changes. I didn't respond. I let it be forwarded to the auditors and the insurance companies. Her objections were dismissed because they were irrelevant to the legal and procedural realities established over the last several months. She had no leverage left. The Mustang was returned to its rightful place, fully restored in appearance, but also elevated in status, protected by law, recognized by the state, untouchable under HOA rules. Its value, both monetary and symbolic, had multiplied. It was no longer merely a personal possession. It was an emblem of order prevailing over arrogance, of preparation prevailing over impulsive authority. The board's final meeting, convened without her, ratified all policy changes. Enforcement protocols were codified, oversight responsibilities clearly assigned, and future violations required thorough documentation and approval by multiple members. Her previous attempts at intimidation, selective enforcement, and unilateral decisions were highlighted in training sessions as examples of what not to do. Melissa Hargrove had become a case study in overreach and its consequences. I walked through the garage, hand lightly brushing the Mustang's polished fender. No words were necessary. The quiet satisfaction of precision and patience was enough. This was revenge delivered not with theatrics or anger, but with systems, law, and documented inevitability. Every misstep she made had compounded against her, and every record ensured that her authority, once absolute in her own mind, would never recover. Residents now saw the HOA differently. They asked questions, verified procedures, and demanded transparency. The neighborhood's power structure had shifted, subtly but permanently, because someone refused to panic, refused to shout, and refused to overlook what was right. Melissa sent her last email, terse and clipped, hinting at frustration without admitting fault. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Victory doesn't need announcement. Systems enforce it. Documentation enforces it. Quiet inevitability enforces it. I stood by the Mustang one evening, the sun low over the lake, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to breathe. The vehicle gleamed in the fading light, every detail a testament to patience, methodical planning, and the certainty that reckoning comes, always, when arrogance is unchecked. It was over, but not in the way anyone expected. Not loud, not dramatic, not vindictive, just complete, total, permanent, and entirely deserved. The Mustang rested. The HOA learned a lesson they couldn't ignore, and I walked away, leaving the consequences where they belonged. Some victories are quiet, some are invisible, but the ones that last, they don't need anyone to witness them. They enforce themselves, and that was the way this one would be remembered.